Evening. I'm very glad to see you all here tonight, coming to the kind of free, open discussion that Cambridge Forum has been producing for almost 40 years, since 1967. I'm Pat Zerke. I'm the current director of the Forum, and I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight for a very timely discussion. We'll be Joe Conason, best-selling author, frequent guest on Al Franken's Air America radio program, is here discussing his new book, The Raw Deal, and addressing the policies and the politics of the Social Security reform movement. My job here tonight is just to give you a quick outline of our format. There is information about Cambridge Forum on the table at the back. There's a mailing list. You can sign up with your snail mail address, your email address, and get information about our future programs. There's information there about our support organization, the Friends of Cambridge Forum. We are a voluntarily supported organization, and that means that you are our foundation and support, and we are grateful to you. There's information about ordering a cassette of this program or of our classic Cambridge Forum programs of the past. And at the back table, there are books for sale after the forum tonight, and our speaker will be willing to sign books for you after the forum tonight. As you know, Cambridge Forum's public programs are recorded for future radio broadcast. So there is a microphone here in the center aisle, and when you ask questions of the speaker later after his formal remarks, I would ask that you all come forward and use that microphone. That way your questions and comments, as well as the speaker's responses, are recorded. In addition, WGBH is here tonight digitally videotaping the forum so that it will be available on demand on their WGBH Forum network as a webcast, also as a downloadable podcast if you have one of those little iPod devices. It will be available at wgbh.org/forum. Our forum tonight is moderated by James Roosevelt, Jr. He's the former Associate Commissioner for Retirement Policy at the Social Security Administration. He's a grandson of the architect of the New Deal, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's written widely about the current efforts to transform Social Security, and he's written a foreword for the Raw Deal. After Joe Conason's opening remarks, our moderator will open the discussion with some questions of his own. He will then open the floor for audience questions. And they, as I said, when you come forward, you are giving us your permission to record you for later broadcasts, potentially. We record everything, but there's one thing we don't want to record, and that is the ringing of your cell phone or pager or beeper. So if you have such an electronic device, now is the time to turn it off before it's recorded. Okay. Again, thank you all for coming, and here's our moderator. He'll introduce the program and the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm James Roosevelt, Jr. My grandfather, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was the founder of the Social Security system and, as mentioned, the architect of the New Deal. And I'm here to speak with author Joe Conason about his new book, The Raw Deal. I was particularly pleased to be asked to write a preface for this book because I think that the books that Joe Conason has been writing over the past several years really speak the truth about what's going on in Washington and in this country. And I think it is so important that we all, as citizens, read and hear the truth. So I've been very pleased to see what he has written about Social Security. The Social Security program, which provides retirement income, disability insurance, and survivors' benefits to Americans of all ages and all walks of life, is arguably the most popular and most successful program created during the New Deal era. We've all heard Social Security called the third rail of politics. To touch it was to die, to commit political suicide. With that level of popular support, how did this effective and trusted program come under attack? How has the current, once unthinkable campaign to privatize Social Security developed support to move its agenda forward? Who supports the privatization movement, and who benefits from it? What impact have recent natural disasters had on the privatization movement? Will the impetus for changing Social Security regain momentum after the 2006 midterm election? These are the questions that Joe Conason addresses in his latest book, The Raw Deal: How the Bush Republicans Plan to Destroy Social Security and the Legacy of the New Deal. Joe Conason is national correspondent for the New York Observer, where he writes a weekly syndicated column. He is also a columnist for Salon.com and the investigative editor for the American Prospect magazine. His previous books, Big Lies, The Right-Wing Propaganda Machine and How It Distorts the Truth, and The Hunting of the President, written with Gene Lyons, were both national bestsellers. He is a regular guest on the Air America radio network, The Al Franken Show, usually on Fridays, and as you know, The Al Franken Show is heard on Air America from noon to 3 here Eastern Time, and then at 11:30 p.m. on the Sundance Channel on television. And we're pleased to, for a year now, have had an Air America station here in Boston at 1430 and 1200 on the radio dial. For those of you who've heard him there, he needs no introduction, but he's just had one. So welcome to Cambridge Forum, Joe Conason.
Well, I have to say it's a great honor to be introduced by James Roosevelt Jr., not only in his own right, a very distinguished and accomplished American, but the grandson of the person who was in my household when I was growing up, the deity of the household. We weren't very religious, but FDR was sort of the, if my mother had a deity, that was who he was. So, and that was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it very much, and I'm very happy to be back in Cambridge, where I've spent a lot of time over the years. I have family and friends here and worked here one of my first jobs in journalism. Now, I know what's on all your minds. It's probably not Social Security, as important as that is. I know you want to know whose names are in the sealed indictments that we hope and pray have been prepared by the legally constituted authorities in Washington, but I don't know the answer to that, so I have to try to distract you for a few minutes by talking about another aspect of life under the Bush regime. Now, over the past few months, we've learned in the starkest terms what happens when the party that governs our country has contempt for government. When the people in charge see the state as a cookie jar to be looted, or a trough that they can use to feed themselves and their friends, and nothing more than that. After Hurricane Katrina ruined New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, we found out in very concrete terms how destructive that contempt could be to human beings and to whole communities. We heard about someone called Brownie, the failed horse show functionary and college pal who was put in charge of FEMA, one of the most critical agencies of government in the modern era. Michael Brown, which is his actual name, could be appointed to that position only by an administration with utter disregard for government's most critical functions, which is to say to protect the lives and property of the citizens, and contempt actually for the people who depend on those services, meaning us. Brown, of course, was not the only patronage crony who was put in charge of a FEMA office. As we went around the country, some newspapers were reporting the various hacks and campaign pork choppers who had been put in charge of different FEMA offices who had no idea what they were doing. And God help the people in those regions if anything bad should occur there, because there was nobody qualified to try to look after them and help them. In essence, the Bush administration had dismantled FEMA by replacing qualified professionals with cronies, by cutting its budget, and by allowing the essential ties between the federal government and state and local agencies to decay. The victims of the neglect, as we saw on television during Katrina, were, of course, the most vulnerable people, the poor, the elderly, children who lost their parents, and everybody who could not fend for themselves, everybody who was not prepared to live in the sort of dog-eat-dog world that conservative so-called government was preparing for us. This is government at its very worst: incompetent, unfair, and suspected of corruption, ultimately, because what came next were the contracts that were going to their friends. But I want to tell you that the hurricane's aftermath saw a different type of government as well in action. The Social Security Administration immediately began to provide benefits to 650,000 people in the counties affected by the hurricane. They opened up temporary offices all over the place. They kept their own offices open late, vastly extended hours. They were making sure that people who needed the checks that they relied on every month got them right away. And this created a substantial influx of cash to the region that's, of course, continuing, because you always get your Social Security check. It doesn't matter whether you know somebody, whether you're a friend of Brownie, whether you, happen to be in the right political party. None of that matters. You are going to get the check because it is a universal entitlement. They were there in the Astrodome. I mean, the Social Security Administration came through for people down there, and they will continue to do that, especially for the people who are the most vulnerable. Again, kids who've lost their parents will continue to receive benefits. People who were disabled and can't work as a result of the hurricane. This is a different model of government. This is the liberal tradition of government that serves people, that is fair, and that is efficient, that works, government that works, and that is not staffed with cronies and crooks. Now, this represents an important choice for us, for Americans, to see the kind of government that the Bush administration represents, and to yet still have, in the form of Social Security Administration, which they haven't managed to destroy, something that represents what I would call traditional American government that's been constructed in our country over the last 100 years. You don't have to be a radical to want to preserve Social Security and everything that it represents in terms of a liberal government that works. You actually have to be a right-wing radical to want to tear it down, and that is exactly what they want to do. It's very significant in light of all of that the President has announced to us, and did immediately after last year's election, that his most important dream, his first priority for his second term, was to dismantle Social Security. Now, they never put it that way. As I discuss in the book, they don't say that. They don't say we're going to phase out Social Security. They don't say we're going to dismantle or we don't like Social Security. They love Social Security. The President will tell you that. When he first came into office, he appointed a commission to strengthen Social Security. But if you look at what they actually intend to do, they also won't say they want to privatize it anymore either. That word has been taken away. You're not supposed to say it. Only Democrats are allowed to say that word anymore. Republicans actually get fined if they say privatize by their bosses. But why does he want to do that? Why do they want to take Social Security away and change it into a private system? There are a number of reasons. I discuss them in the book, but really there are two. fundamental reasons for doing this. One is that this has been an ideological goal of the American right for 70 years, really since the very beginning of the system. As I discuss in the book, when Jim's grandfather legislated Social Security and got it through Congress, where, by the way, it was considered the moderate position, actually. There were people who wanted much more radical systems than the one that FDR managed to pass. But when it was passed, it was only over the opposition, ideological opposition of the Republican Party and the business community that was the clear and transparently dominant force in that party. The National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, organizations that still exist and are still very powerful today, by the way, and are playing a role in the privatization campaign, a big role, opposed Roosevelt then. Their position was that Social Security would, if it were legislated, would cause everyone to stop working. Everybody would just stop working, and morality would decay, and we would become a nation of shiftless layabouts, which I think has been adequately contradicted in the 70-year history of the system, with the most enormous economic growth that the world has ever seen, by far. So, but that was what they felt, and they still feel the same way about it. They still feel, ideologically, it's wrong for society to look after the disabled, to look after the elderly whose savings run out, to look after the people who've worked hard all their lives and haven't been able to save enough to manage a dignified retirement, to look after people who have been disabled. This is not what they consider to be a legitimate function of government, and they would get rid of it. Now, there's a second motive that had not occurred to people 70 years ago, which is the shift of revenue from one place to another, from one set of pockets, which is to say the checks that are going out to all those people in the Gulf every month, to another set of pockets, which is very well-to-do financial interests on Wall Street. Now, I know that sounds, I don't know, it sounds very left-wing probably, but that is a fact. That is what they want to do, and there's no other way to describe it. They want to take the revenue stream of Social Security, which somebody described to me the other day as kind of the Mississippi River of money. I mean, it's just this enormous stream of revenue. It represents now, in the expenditures side, now 23% of the federal budget every year, which is a very big pot of money indeed. They want to take that Mississippi River and divert its flow somewhere else. And the somewhere else would represent $1 trillion over the next several decades in fees and charges, other charges alone. $1 trillion, $980 billion, give or take $20 billion, into the pockets of Wall Street interests and other large financial corporations. Depending on how you structured a privatized system, you would have banks, insurance companies, your credit card companies that would start selling you securities. I mean, the number of interests that might profit from this kind of a change in how we have our retirement security financed is endless. I mean, you could have Walmart, selling you stocks for your retirement portfolio eventually. Now, that's not what they proposed to begin with, but certainly the support for this idea comes, in terms of money, comes from those sectors. This is not accidental. This plan, which I discussed in the book, was laid out 20 years ago, because we've seen over time there's been a sort of generational waxing and waning of the attempt to get rid of Social Security. There was a moment of enormous struggle in 1936 when Alf Landon ran against FDR on the platform of stopping Social Security and was promptly crushed by defeat. Then they were quiet about it for a while. Actually, pretty much 30 years went by before it came up again, partly because the Republican Party for a long time was dominated by a more reasonable type of Republican, like President Eisenhower, who realized that Social Security was a good system and that Republicans who were going to try to abolish it were crazy. And he referred specifically, he wrote a letter to his brother that I quote in the book, in which he refers to Texas oil men and other wacky right-wingers who might want to get rid of Social Security, which I thought was one of the most prescient things I'd ever read in my life. Anyway, that all stopped until 1964, when Barry Goldwater became the presidential nominee of the Republican Party on an explicit platform of abolishing Social Security or making it voluntary, which would be the same thing. And he also promptly was crushed because after 30 years of experience with the system, people liked it pretty much the way it was. And he won only 6 states in the old Confederacy. But he introduced to politics another figure, Ronald Reagan, who made a famous speech during that campaign that was televised called A Time to Choose. And again, that speech was about why Social Security was not going to work. It was going to fail. We were going down the same path as the despicable French, who had their own disastrous, social benefit systems that Reagan thought were sending the French over the cliff. They still seem to be there too, 40 years later. But what that campaign and what Reagan's speech represented was a marker that was laid down for a generation of conservatives. Ever since then, getting rid of Social Security, phasing it out, making it voluntary, privatizing it, has been the generational goal for conservatives in America. That is it's their holy grail. It's the thing that if they could achieve that, then they would feel they had finally dismantled the liberal legacy and they could, go back to the golf course. I mean, they'd be done. And they would be right. They would be right. That would be pretty much the end of the game. They expected to accomplish, and when I say they, I mean many of the same people, by the way, who were in the Goldwater campaign in 1964 are still very active in conservative politics now, and they are pursuing the goal that they had back then. With great determination. You have to give them credit for this. They, latch onto you. It's like, a dog that's biting you, and if you cut off its head, it will still be biting you. It doesn't matter. They're going to keep doing this. They thought that they would have another opportunity when Reagan was elected president. This was going to be a big chance. And one of the reasons they thought they would have a great chance when Reagan was elected president, frankly, was because the system actually was in trouble at that point. It was underfinanced towards the end of the 70s. They were looking towards a moment when the trust funds were running out of revenue. And the combination of that and having a conservative president, a very right-wing president like Reagan, made them think, this is it. We're going to get Social Security now. Unfortunately for them, a gentleman from this fine city named Tip O'Neill was in charge of the House of Representatives, and there was no way on earth he was going to let that happen. Basically, he told them to get lost, and so did a lot of Republicans, by the way, in the House. And Reagan, who was a lot smarter than he looked, understood that this was not going to happen this way and signed on to some reforms of the system that made it solvent for 70 years, 1983, with the help of Alan Greenspan, among others, who's played a much more villainous role in this lately. But at that time, they came up with some changes in benefits and tax increases and some other changes in the program that Jim could probably explain much better than I can, but that essentially restored the solvency and built up the trust funds tremendously for the future. It was actually a very good thing that they did, probably the best thing that President Reagan did altogether. And yet, the conservatives still did not give up on this. They wrote a plan in 1980, and when I say they, in this case I'm talking about the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, which you may all have heard of before. These are two leading conservative think tanks. I don't know if conservative is the right word. Two very right-wing think tanks in Washington. that came together and wrote a plan for creating really a coalition and a campaign to privatize Social Security. A paper had been written by a student at Harvard Law School, as a matter of fact, named Peter Ferrara, that proposed privatizing Social Security. The Cato Institute, which was a new organization then, published his plan as a book. And then two people, one from Heritage and one from Cato, wrote a paper together called, I believe it was called A Leninist Plan for Dealing with Social Security, which is all it really meant was that they were very ruthless about this. They were going to, take no prisoners. But laid out a strategy which basically said, we have our ideological reasons for doing this, and the Republican Party is receptive to this kind of idea. And we can create grassroots, or what look like grassroots, support organizations for this, particularly among young people. But we need money. And so what we have to do is go to the banks and the insurance companies and others who would benefit from this change, is what the paper, actually, this little document says, and get them behind this, get them to take a stand, get business to come in and try to educate people that the system really doesn't work, it's always going to be in danger, and get them to put millions of dollars behind this. Now, nothing happened for a long time. First of all, when Clinton became president, I think they realized that, well, first of all, when the Reagan compromise occurred, that was kind of the end for a while. But they, again, never gave up. And during the 90s, the Cato Institute actually started its own project on Social Security privatization, which they changed the name of later because privatization turned up bad in a poll. They took a poll and they found out people hated that word, so they changed the name of it. But they began to build, again, an intellectual basis for this and to start to create a base for privatization among major corporations. These companies have spent millions of dollars every year for 10 years on studies. These think tanks are wonderful because it's a great place for a certain type of scholar, and I use the word scholar in quotes here, to work because you know how your study is going to come out before you start to do it. So if American Express tells you, we'd like a study of Social Security privatization, how do you think that'll turn out? And you work for the Cato Institute, you can say, I think that'll turn out very well. I'll get back to you in 6 months when we've written it, That's how this works, and they've spent a lot of money to try to create an intellectual basis for this, most of which is actually quite shoddy and shabby, and I examined some of that in the book. They set out to prove things like Social Security is bad for African Americans because they tend to die sooner, and it ignores a lot of other factors about Social Security that are progressive and that actually are more beneficial to poor people, including minorities. It's bad for women for this reason. It's bad for young people for that reason. And at the same time, they started to create what we call astroturf groups, which means fake grassroots. These are groups that are intended to mimic the representation of groups in the population. Because after all, you cannot have a group of, sort of those little cartoon plutocrats with the top hats. Like, if those are the only people you're representing, you're not going to win in politics in America. So you have to look like you have a much broader and more diverse constituency. And so the privatization movement, you could say, has had to try to create the illusion, really, of diverse, broad support. And so they've come up with various groups that they have an African-American group. Turns out the African-American group actually is run by some white people at another conservative think tank. And this was exposed in a very funny episode that I talk about in the book. It's one of my favorite things. I don't know how many people here watch C-SPAN in the morning. You have to be a real sort of public affairs junkie to do that. But C-SPAN has a show called Washington Journal. And every morning on Washington Journal, if you get up early enough, you can see some figure from sort of Washington public life come on the show and talk with the host about whatever they're doing and the issues of the day. And sometimes it'll be a journalist, and sometimes it'll be somebody from a lobbying group or an advocacy group. So one day, the show was going to host, C-SPAN Washington Journal was going to have on African-American conservative who was going to talk about Social Security, among other things. The problem, and he was from a group called Project 21, and the problem was his car broke down on the way to the studio. So, frantic, he called his office and said, I'm not going to be able to make it, you have to send someone else. So they sent the executive director of this African-American conservative organization. And the host of Washington Journal that particular morning also happened to be black. So he's sitting in the studio waiting for the guest to come on, and in walks this white guy. And he says, and the host says, wait a minute. He looks at his notes and he says, African-American conservative, but you're white. And, the guy had a good explanation, I'm sure, but it was what a blogger who wrote about it called a Wizard of Oz moment. And they have a women's group that tries to explain why Social Security is bad for women. It doesn't actually have any members except people who are employed by these right-wing think tanks. There are about 6 women who belong to this group. And it has a website, but it doesn't really have any members, unlike, say, the National Organization for Women, which has a lot of members and supports Social Security. They have a seniors group called the United Seniors Association, which has been around for a while. And it's interesting, too, because it was founded by a man named Richard Viguerie, who was in the Goldwater campaign and kind of a brilliant conservative entrepreneur and organizer, and has wanted to abolish Social Security from the bottom of his black-hearted soul, for 40 years. But the United Seniors Association is a really beautiful AstroTurf group because it also has, no one knows if it really has any members, but it is financed by the pharmaceutical industry and oil companies. And campaigns against, they'll campaign against improving Medicare, which obviously is not in the interest of seniors at all. And they put on a big push to privatize Social Security. And in fact, they made it their job to denigrate and slander, basically, the AARP, which has been the bulwark of defense of Social Security in this current period. They've accused them of being in favor of gay marriage. Can you imagine the AARP being in favor of gay marriage? And of hating our troops somehow, or disrespecting our troops. I mean, just the usual sort of right-wing demagogy. Pretty desperate stuff, but they're paid a lot of money to do it. And, that's their job. So you have this panoply of groups. Interestingly enough, you would think that changing Social Security might actually appeal to younger workers. You can fabricate an argument that is probably the most plausible one, on the surface at least. They have never been able to get a Social Security privatization youth group off the ground. It just hasn't worked. Young people are much smarter than the right wing takes them for. They were the age cohort that voted most reliably for John Kerry last year, at a time when the president was starting to talk about privatizing Social Security, so it didn't work. But all of these groups really represent a strain of dishonesty in modern conservatism that is quite disturbing to anybody who wants to see a candid debate about these issues. Because it's an attempt to fool people. It's an attempt to trick people into taking action, political action, against their own interest. It is very heavily financed, and you wonder why this is necessary. The reason it's necessary is that if people understood who the interests are that are trying to push this plan forward and why they're doing it, the support for it would be even less than it is now. They now have, less than a third of the public supporting privatization, and I think it's going to be on the back burner for quite a while. But I would tell you this. I also believe that if the Republicans win the congressional elections next year, if they maintain control of both houses, you will certainly see this plan come back in some form in 2007. They still see the Bush administration as their great opportunity. Whatever problems, Bush has right now, he is going to be in office, at least he seems like he will be, until 2008. Rove may go, and Scooter Libby, they will bring in other people to run things at the White House. And they will continue to do what they see as their, some of them see as their God-given task, but what they all see as their generational task, the task of their movement, which is to dismantle government, which is to take government and turn it, as Grover Norquist said, into something the size small enough to drown in the bathtub. They can't do that without phasing out Social Security. There's no way to do it. So what I hope people are beginning to understand from watching how this government behaves, its incredible failures, not just in the Gulf and New Orleans, but in Iraq and elsewhere, that these are people who are dismantling a democratic system. To have them running your government is like asking the termites to fix your house. And we don't have the right to let them do that, and I hope they'll be stopped. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for that very insightful commentary. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Joe Conason discussing the raw deal, current Social Security policies and politics. Now I get the moderator's privilege of asking the first question or two, and then we'll go forward to taking questions from the audience. So I guess maybe we'll bring you back up here, and I'll move over to this microphone.
Okay.
Every 15 or 20 years, Social Security has been adjusted to meet our changing workforce and our changing economy. Do you object, as I do, to the use of the term reform for not just what the Bush administration is trying to do and Republicans in Congress, but for the sorts of changes that the people who want to do away with Social Security are proposing?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Jim. I hear even the most well-intentioned people use the word reform to describe what the president has tried to do. And to me, it's a terrible misuse of the term. To me, reform means improve. It doesn't just mean change, or it certainly doesn't mean destroy. So I do object to that. I think it is, again, part and parcel of an attempt to misuse language. And I discuss this in the book at some length. I talk about, as I mentioned before, the fact that they've stopped using the word privatization. They prefer to use terms like personal accounts, and this is all determined by work with not only polls but focus groups to try to figure out how to sell this plan. Reform is also a word that tests well traditionally, and so they use that word whether it applies or not, and I object strongly to it.
I know we're focusing on Social Security, but I do want to ask one question related to your opening remarks. Do you think it's likely that the investigation currently going on with regard to exposing a CIA agent to danger it will reach all the way to the Vice President himself?
Well, the New York Times reported, as you know, that the Vice President was actually the one who revealed Valerie Plame's CIA identity to his Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby. Now, that story was based on anonymous sources, and we don't know if it's accurate or not. I had another reporter for the Washington Post tell me he couldn't report the same story. He couldn't show that that was true yet. However, I think it's very clear from the beginning of this matter that the Vice President has had motive and opportunity to perpetrate this. The motive was that Ambassador Joe Wilson, had embarrassed him by reporting what he had discovered in Niger about the fact that Iraq had not apparently sought to buy uranium there. Vice President Cheney was out front making the argument that Iraq represented a nuclear threat to the United States. And so, and Wilson not only went to Niger and came back with the report saying that these allegations were untrue, but he had indirectly been sent there at the request of Cheney. And Cheney was very angry when Wilson came back and talked about that. So he had a motive. It was by the time they did this to the Wilsons, it was becoming abundantly clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I think the White House is very worried about the implications of that politically, which are beginning to show in their poll numbers now and have for a while. So I would be very surprised if it did not eventually reach the Vice President.
You're listening to Joe Conason discussing the raw deal. Let's take some questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please come to this microphone here in the center aisle.
Hi, thank you for your talk so far. I'd like to comment that I'm no way in favor of privatizing Social Security, but I think the danger is much less than is being made out to be, since it's proposed that this would be completely voluntary, which would mean that most people would have to make the conscious decision to make this change and redirect money from that's being withheld to Social Security and put into these private accounts, and then make a decision as to how that money is to be invested. People don't like to make changes, and when it comes to their 401ks, it takes a lot of arm twisting to get people to sign up even for that. So even if this were to pass, I don't see how it would. I think it would have a fairly minimal effect.
Well, I'll give my answer to that, and then maybe Jim would like to answer that too. There are two answers to that. One is the financial implications of partial privatization impact the whole system. And once people start to pull out of it, especially if younger people stopped contributing, you have an insoluble arithmetic problem, basically. This is what the President's Commission discovered when they tried to come up with a viable privatization plan. They came up with 3 different plans, and the math didn't work for any of them. So that's number one. Number two, they've tried a voluntary plan in England for 20 years. It has been an unmitigated disaster. People say, well, it worked in Chile, which isn't really true either, but the British experience is the closest to ours. It's the country that's the most like ours. And they are now trying to figure out how to get back to a system that is more like our system, because so many people there were victimized by fraud. So many elderly people now have been pushed back into poverty there. And Prime Minister Blair is desperately trying to figure out how they can actually reform, in the true meaning of that term, their system so that it more resembles ours. Jim mentioned I worked for the American Prospect, and last winter, when this was a very hot issue, I hired a reporter for the Financial Times, which is not exactly a left-wing newspaper, and asked her to investigate the British system for us. And she came back with a devastating report about its effects, in which she quoted British conservative businessmen saying, "We wish we still had a system like the American Social Security system." So you want to address that, Jim?
I'll just comment that how quickly a privatization law could undermine and destroy the Social Security system depends on the details. Privatization could be the default option. You might have to make an affirmative election to stay in the current system, for example. But what Joe has said is exactly correct. Social Security is very carefully calculated by actuaries at the Social Security Administration. They are reliable. In fact, they're pessimistic and conservative, the way actuaries tend to be. There are deputy commissioners for administration, human resources, things like that at Social Security. The actuary is so important that while he ranks with all the other deputy commissioners, his title is just the actuary. And and you have to have all the pieces work as they now do, and as they, with adjustments for our changing economy every 15 or 20 years, have historically and can continue to keep it from becoming, as Joe says, just a math problem that doesn't work.
Yeah, you mentioned actuarial numbers. My question touches on that. It's such a hot topic for Democrats also to approach Social Security. When your grandfather started the program, I think the male life expectancy was about 65 years. And we've had such a significant increase now, yet only a couple years have been extended on the starting age. Do you think that we need to look at that and perhaps people should work a little bit longer before the Social Security starts?
Well, certainly, again, I'm sure Jim has his own response to that, but I would say that at some point in the future, we will have to look at various changes to the system. As Jim points out, every few decades, in order to maintain the 75-year solvency projection that you're supposed to have, there are changes that are made in taxes, in benefits, and potentially in the retirement age. I mean, I don't consider that to be an unreasonable proposal eventually. What I would say, though, is that Social Security's finances are really kind of the least of our problems in America right now. I mean, it is the outlook for Social Security is very good compared to other financial problems that we face, particularly in Medicare and in deficits. And so my view is that the Democrats have actually taken a wise position on this, which is to say we don't need to do anything right now, and we're not going to even discuss making any changes to this system until you Republicans take privatization off the table, because we're not even going to talk about that with you. And I think for now that position is fine. In the future, someday, yes, clearly if life expectancies keep rising, as we hope they will, and people stay in the workforce longer, then you could gradually raise the retirement age. You don't want to, the only problem with that is this. People who have certain types of jobs, jobs that are very physically demanding, cannot, necessarily work longer, many more years than they already do. And so you have to make, if you're going to raise the retirement age, you have to make some kinds of allowances for people who do physical labor, because they eventually their bodies start to break down and they can't do it anymore. So with that caution, I would say it's something that could be considered someday.
I'd only add that physical labor doesn't include just construction work. It includes taking care of pre-kindergarten kids. And some people at 65 are very vigorous. We're still at a point where some people are old at 66, 67, which is what the retirement age is on its way to now. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to change the standards for the disability part of the system. That, again, that's a further complication. And frankly, until there is a more balanced government, as there was when Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan worked together, it's premature.
Mr. Conniff, I'm curious. Why do you think the Bush administration has so far been unable to ruin the professional staff and management of Social Security, while they did ruin the professional staff and management of FEMA? And I might add, they may be on their way to ruining the professional staff and management of FDA, just as one other example, perhaps among many.
Well, I would say it's not for want of trying.
I assume
certainly there have been people put into the Social Security Administration whose aim is to dismantle it. I can name them, but it's not necessary. There are people who are brought in there from the Cato Institute and elsewhere whose idea is that they want to take the system apart. But the Social Security Administration is actually very large, and there are many, many civil servants there who are completely dedicated to the mission of the agency. They've been there for a long time, and it would take many years to get rid of enough of them to make a difference, in my view. Jim obviously knows much more about this than I do.
I didn't mean to turn this into a Huntley Brinkley sort of thing here, but
good to have somebody who knows something here.
Well, what you said is exactly true. There are many dedicated civil servants at Social Security, and it is an extremely efficient agency under the Al Gore, Bill Clinton reduction in the size of government. They actually did reduce the size of government. They went from 85,000 employees down to 65,000, and these are very efficient, effective folks. But Senator Patrick Moynihan promoted and got passed something very important, which is that the Social Security became an independent agency. Sort of the opposite of FEMA was put into the Department of Homeland Security. Social Security was taken out of the Department of Health and Human Services. And the commissioner, while the commissioner is a political appointee, and she has a strong political background, she also was one of the Social Security trustees before being appointed, and she's appointed for a term longer than the term of the president, and confirmed by the Senate. And the career employees look at that structure and are not intimidated or undermined as easily or as quickly as in an agency like FEMA or potentially the FDA.
The other thing is that FEMA, the destruction of FEMA kind of happened from the very top. In other words, you had to have somebody at the top who knew what they were doing. Social Security is more decentralized in a way. There are regional offices, and the functions that occur there don't necessarily depend on the commissioner as much on a day-to-day basis as an emergency depends on the conduct of the head of FEMA.
Long live the civil service.
It's an honor to meet you both. I'm not sure if everybody here is aware. There was a moment when the support for the privatization was waning, and President Bush used some, I guess, creative statistics about the African American community and how they would benefit more from privatization. And I was just wondering if you would discuss the significance of using race to build support for this plan.
Well, it didn't work. African Americans are actually the most hostile to privatization of any population group in the country, according to every poll that I've looked at. But it's certainly true that attempt was made, and that harks back to some of the studies that I was talking about that have been financed through Cato and Heritage that attempt to show through basically statistical trickery that Social Security is unfair to African Americans. The Social Security Administration debunked those studies thoroughly, and I discuss that's all talked about in the book. I mean, the fact that the president would raise that subject again in light of the how intellectually disreputable it is among economists I was startled by that. I remember when he did that, and I was amazed by that. But it was a little bit of a desperation move, and it didn't work.
I don't know if I'm going to be heard. There is one reform that I think would be important, and that is the Social Security tax cap. You know, that after, $87,000, now you don't pay. So it winds up transferring money.
89.
89. It winds up transferring money, in a sense, from the poorer. And why isn't it the Democrats don't, try to promote, or the liberals in Congress, that kind of a reform?
I think I should explain what you're talking about a little bit. The lady is referring to the cap on Social Security taxes, on FICA taxes, which is capped at roughly $90,000 of income annually. And there's, of course, all kinds of income and wealth that isn't taxed but for that. But what's interesting about that is that most Americans don't know about that. They have no idea, because most Americans make much less than that. The median income is under $50,000, and most people have no experience of earning enough so that any of their social earnings would not be subject to Social Security taxes. Now, earlier this year, actually, when the president started to discuss Social Security, and he was barnstorming the country and talking about how it was going bankrupt and so on, some polls were done on what should be done to reform Social Security. And the pollsters would ask people, well, do you think that cap should be raised on the Social Security tax? And lots of people said, what? What cap? They didn't know. They knew nothing about it. And when the poll taker would then subsequently say, well, now, which solution do you like for dealing with any shortfall in Social Security? Cutting benefits, raising the retirement age, or raising the cap on Social Security taxes? Raising the cap on Social Security taxes was the only solution that most people liked. And once they learned that this existed. So I think your question is a very pertinent one. Why progressives would not make that an important issue? I think when the time comes that there is a real serious debate over changes in the system, that will certainly be at the top of the agenda for I think, anybody who's in the progressive side, and probably many Democrats. I really think that is going to be an important issue. And it's not an accident, of course, that the President said that was the thing that he definitely didn't want to do.
I'm mindful of your remark that if the Republicans take the House and Senate in the next election, I'm mindful of your remark that if the Republicans take the House and Senate in the next election, Social Security, again, is up for grabs. I'm a little distressed at the amount of information out about the corrupted elections. In fact, the GAO just published a document saying that the likelihood of an honest election in 2006 is somewhat remote. Can you comment on those two rather difficult situations in which we find ourselves?
That is the question that gets asked everywhere I go, is about voting machines and whether we can rely on an honest election system. And it's, of course, the question that I can't answer. I don't have a good answer to that, except to say that, of course, people need to become active themselves, become poll watchers, and that I would think both parties, but certainly the Democratic Party, which has been on the receiving end of these questionable vote counts for a while now, has to get out and organize lawyers and poll watchers to make sure that this is that we have an honest election. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to monitor this, and the more monitoring that's done, the harder it is for people to cheat. But it's certainly understandable that people are very feel a great deal of anxiety about that.
Given the fact that George Bush had this as his first priority, and we know that Karl Rove is very involved in every priority of George Bush, has this made you rethink? I know Democrats would have cast him as kind of the evil genius. Have we maybe overemphasized how, like, his strategic intelligence in this case?
Well, you know, they got pretty far. But it is true that the Social Security campaign it's an important failure of Karl Rove. He was directing that campaign from a war room in the White House last spring. He was having all of these AstroTurf groups and corporate groups come and meet with him regularly to run this campaign. He oversaw the spending of tens of millions of dollars to try to convince people that they should be in favor of this. And in the end, more people were against it than had been at the beginning. So I think what it really represents is a triumph of ideology over calculation. I think had they sort of looked at this in a really hard-headed way and looked at the polling numbers, they would have realized this was too big a hill for them to climb, and that they shouldn't try to do this. But they want it so much, and this is the point that I've been trying to make, and it's why I wrote the book. They want it so much that they aren't going to give up. And the fact that they were defeated last spring does not mean that it's over at all.
Would you comment on the role of the media in selling this idea? I've noticed that even NPR started to say personal account just a few days after Fox News started saying personal account.
Instead of privatization.
Instead of private account or privatization. And clearly the press releases go out, and it seems like the people in front of the microphone just read them. The people in front of the computer keyboard just retype them. Why has the media seemed to play such an important role, being a megaphone for these ideas.
We see, to be a member of the White House press corps, you have to score very high on the thing that says follows instructions well. I mean, that's, otherwise they don't let you do it. The media has been cowed by Bush for a long time, and I think part of it resulted in episodes like that where basically you would probably be accused of being unpatriotic if you started to remind them that they talked about privatization. And I mean that quite literally. They would really attack you, cut off your access, intimidate in a host of different ways. I think there's less of that now. I think that has been reduced a bit by circumstances and also really by the fact that the president is so much more unpopular than he used to be. I mean, they used to call him, it was like part of his name was Popular Wartime President, George W. Bush. But they can't say that anymore, and I think you will see, as a result, a slightly better grade of journalism than you've been getting in the past. And I hope when Social Security comes up again, that will happen too. I mean, the other problem is that they, as we were saying before, they use...
Trust fund is the sum of all the money that's been collected in taxes, Social Security taxes that haven't been paid out yet. But all that money is basically, it buys government bonds. And if the government spends more than they make, where does it come from?
Well, the honest answer to that is they're going to have to raise taxes eventually, because they've been so irresponsible about cutting taxes in the way they've cut taxes. And those bonds are going to have to be redeemed. And if they have to raise taxes to do it, I hope they'll raise taxes on the right people. And I believe that that's going to be the ultimate solution.
My question does not imply an argument. But I'm curious as to what your basis is, or your bases are when you make the allegation, the representation, that corporate America has poured millions of dollars into the sale of what was once called privatization.
Oh, well, that's very simple. I mean, you look at the funding of this stuff is actually fairly transparent if you look it up. There's a group called Progress for America that was involved in this. That's a sort of a Bush White House front group. And you can look up, it's what's called a 527 group. And you can look up, there's a website, if you know how to use it, where you can look up who's giving money to them, because they have to file the reports. There's another group called the Club for Growth, which has been spent millions of dollars on this. And again, they have a 527 account, and you can look up who's given money to them. You can look up who's given money to the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. And it's corporate America in a big way. So, the book, you don't have to write all this down. It's all footnoted in the back of the book. So,
and if I could just add to
Yes.
that, you can look at Cato, where, in fact, my successor as Associate Commissioner for Retirement Policy came from at the Social Security Administration, and Heritage. General corporate America has supported them. If you look at some of these groups that were set up just to promote privatization, they were supported heavily by the financial services industry, which would benefit directly from privatization. And the AFL-CIO began a movement to have their pension funds withdraw funds from financial services organizations that were supporting those privatization groups. And a number of those contributions stopped at that point. So it's a very clear cause and effect.
yes, in fact, the AFL-CIO's decision to do that actually completely destroyed one privatization group on Wall Street. It fell apart because the short-term profit was much more important than the long-term profit, and they decided they didn't want to get in trouble with the union pension fund managers.
Well, this has been a very informative evening. Thank you, Joe Conason.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in October 2005 co-sponsored by the Lowell Institute, the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program, entitled The Raw Deal, featuring Joe Conason, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Jim Roosevelt. Thank you for joining us.